Welcome back to Train Signal Citrix XenApp Training. You're watching Working with Profile Manager lesson. This is going to be another very cool lesson because it deals with profile management. This happens to be another one of those topics that I like very much just because it makes life easier. It makes the environment management easier in general. And profile management, to be honest with you, is one of those components that's in the grand scheme of things, probably the smallest component, but it has the biggest effect. So not having profile management will have the most effect on the environment, the most negative effect on the environment. What we're going to focus on in this lesson is why profile management. We're going to talk about the pros, the cons. Why are you even considering profile management? We're going to talk about the different profile types. There are mandatory profiles and roaming profiles and so on and so forth. We're going to talk about Citrix's profile manager, Citrix's implementation of the profile manager, and we're going to talk about the different profile manager components that are out there. So let's go ahead and get started. Why profile management? So in essence, without profile management, every time a user logs on to a XenApp server and makes any change, logs off, logs back in a second time, the changes that he or she made are gone. Now, because this is a process that is repeated frequently, because users are using XenApp in a production consistent way, this could quickly become annoying. The level or the quality of the user experience becomes degraded. So one of the biggest reasons why XenApp environments fail is because administrators lock down the environment so much where there's no personalization. They don't allow the users to save or customize the desktop or the documents or anything. So the user feels like when they're using a XenApp published application or a XenApp published desktop, so on and so forth, they're getting a lesser device. They're being tied. They're being treated as children, so to speak. So they're not being given a full desktop where they can do whatever they want. So that level, that feeling of personalization goes away and you see resistance. And that's why in a lot of the Citrix shops, it's not a matter of, well, Citrix isn't working or XenApp is slow. No. It's all about perception because the environment was presented to them in the wrong way. So I want to make sure you avoid those hurdles in your environment. Make sure you implement a proper profile management solution so that users can save their user settings. They can customize the wallpaper to some extent. They can put their icons wherever they want them. And if they're logging on from XenApp to XenApp server, every XenApp server they log on to, whether there's a profile on that server or not, they're getting the same consistent user experience. The other reason for profile management is that it improves logon times. And it does that because the alternative to a profile management solution is what Microsoft gives you by default, the roaming profiles, the mandatory profiles. The problem with these particular types of profiles is they're network-based and they copy the entire profile up to the network and download it from the network every time the user logs in. So it becomes cumbersome, especially if that particular profile is loaded with files and settings, etc. Copying it up to the network and down from the network every time the user logs in becomes a very slow process because you have to wait for the whole copy process to complete, and hopefully the copy process doesn't have any errors which lead to corruption, and then you have to address profile issues. So improved logon times significantly with profile management because it saves the data to the network differently than the way traditional roaming profiles do. A consistent user experience is what you strive for, right? So without profile management, you get an inconsistent user experience across different resources. So you have 5 XenApp servers in the environment. The user logs on to the first one, creates a local profile. This is assuming there is no profile management. All right, great. Next time the user goes to log in, they hit XenApp 2. Now XenApp 2, they don't have a local profile on it. It's on XenApp 1, right? So now they have to customize this all over again. Now they log out, log back in, and they hit XenApp 3, and you follow how that goes. Now you're giving the user an inconsistent user experience. Whereas, if the user logs on to XenApp 1, and they make the changes, and you have profile management in place, and takes care of all of that, they log off, they log on to XenApp 2, and they've never logged in there before. Because of the profile management, they have a consistent user experience, don't even know the difference of whether or not they're logging on to the same server. We want to avoid profile corruption with roaming profiles and some of the traditional Microsoft tools that you get with Windows. because the profile is only uploaded once and downloaded once, there is potential for corruption if the copy process doesn't finish properly. There's also the potential for profile corruption because if the same user logs on to 2 XenApp servers at the same time, now they've downloaded their profile from the network onto 2 XenApp servers. Depending on how the user is exiting out of these applications and how the profile is going to be copied back to the network, if it's copying back to the network from XenApp 1 and XenApp 2, then files might be stepping on each other, and as a result it would lead to profile corruption, which is one of the main reasons why we always advise customers not to implement roaming profiles, just because of the amount of help desk calls that you would receive. So again, we want to avoid profile corruption at all costs. And one of the other reasons why profile management isn't typically implemented is because it's not really understood, and the value of profile management is not understood, and I don't want that to happen to you. Profile management, it has a different word now. We call it user workspace virtualization, which is basically the same way we separate the hardware from the software when you're doing virtualization, and we separate the application from the OS when you're doing application virtualization. Well, when you're doing user workspace virtualization, you're separating the user and the user settings from the operating system as well. But what you're also doing is you're separating those application-specific user settings. So it's not just about the profile, and it's not about copying the entire profile. That's too much, too big, too much information. I don't need it. I want the user-specific information that I can port from server to server. I want the application-specific information that I can save the user time and provide that consistent user experience that they're used to. User profile types. So there are different types of profiles, right? So there are mandatory profiles and there are roaming profiles. You're probably familiar with both of them. Roaming profiles are it's a type of profile where the user can make changes, and as soon as they log out, then all the changes that they made during that particular session are saved up to a network share somewhere. Now, the disadvantage of a roaming profile is that the session will wait until the user logs off before it initiates that copy process up to the network. So it doesn't copy any of the changes that have been done during the course of the session or the logon until the user initiates the log off. And then when the user goes to log back in, at that point it initiates a download of the entire profile. So there's no flexibility there. It's an all or nothing type scenario. And again, we talked about some of the cons and some of the profile corruptions that this could lead to. So what Microsoft has done is they've offered you another type, roaming profile, except instead of allowing the user to make changes, you're locking it down so that every time the user logs in, they're getting the same lockdown mandatory profile. Now, mandatory profile still has to copy down every time the user logs in, but it doesn't have to copy out when the user logs out because it's a lockdown version of a profile. The user can't write anything back up to that particular profile. So it's a little better than a roaming profile, but from a user experience perspective, again, it's very limited, and from a logon times perspective, it's very, very high. So there's got to be a better way. Now, local profiles are great. The only problem with local profile is they're local to a particular server or a particular device that you're logging onto. So again, in instances where you have 50 XenApp servers and that particular user is going to log on 50 times, every time they log in, they would have to configure that particular profile so it's local. The disadvantage as well is every now and then you're going to run maintenance on those XenApp servers and clean up all the local profiles. Now, the next time the user logs in, they got to recreate all 50 profiles. So it could quickly become very, very cumbersome. So there's got to be a better way, and there is. Citrix Profile Manager is one of those better ways of managing user profiles. Now, Citrix acquired this technology from a company called Cipago. And one of the advantages of Citrix Profile Manager is that instead of waiting for the user to log off and copy the entire profile up to the network, what Citrix Profile Manager allows you to do is as the user is making changes to particular files, those particular changes are copied up to the network. Not the whole profile is copied up to the network, and it doesn't wait until log off. So as you're making these changes and you're saving files, it copies them up to the network in the background. Now, some of the added advantages that when you go to log back in, instead of downloading your entire profile, Citrix will put pointers to files, for example, that you have on the desktop. Let's say you have a couple of Word files, a couple of Excel files. It doesn't download them. It'll just put a pointer to those files. So as far as you're concerned, you're looking at the desktop, it looks the same, your background's there, everything's there. If you go to access these files, at that point it will request that file from the network and download it. That significantly lightens up the load of that particular profile, so it is not a very heavy profile, not a very large profile to download or upload. Now, there are third-party profile management solutions out there that even take it one step further and give you significant more control and power, and some of these are RES Software and AppSense, and I strongly recommend you take a look at both, especially if the environment that you're about to deploy is large scale. The Citrix Profile Manager is definitely better than the tools that come with the Windows or the standard native Microsoft products, but if you wanted to take it one step further and do this properly, then you need to go to a third party like RES Software, for example. Citrix Profile Management. So the components that make up Citrix Profile Management, or some of the features or characteristics of Citrix Profile Management, is that it's a network-based profile. So again, you're saving your settings to a network somewhere. It's centralized, so you're able to give the multiple devices or the multiple servers, they can all see that network-based profile and download it whenever they need to. It's a profile solution for XenApp, for XenDesktop, and local desktop. So you can use this outside of just XenApp and XenDesktops and pretty much use it even just without any Citrix infrastructure in general if you wanted to, even though it's a Citrix product, but it's not really tied to XenApp or XenDesktop in a way where it can't be used outside of them. So there's no reason why you can't load the agent on a regular Windows 7 machine and then via group policy just apply all the settings that you want. The configuration of the profile management is done typically via GPO. That's the centralized, easy way of making the changes. Or you can make the configuration via an INI file, so it's INI configuration driven. The profile management components, there are three components. There's an endpoint agent. Again, this endpoint agent can be installed on XenApp servers, XenDesktop virtual machines or VDI. It can also be installed on just standard physical machines that have nothing to do with Citrix, like Windows 7 or XP or anything like that. So once you install the endpoint agent, then you can control how you're customizing that agent, what settings you're pushing and enforcing on that agent via a group policy object ADM file. So I'll show you once we get into the demonstration how you can upload that particular file and modify it so that the agent engine that you've installed can take advantage of those particular settings. Another way of configuring the agent that's installed on those endpoint is via an INI file. It's text-based. You go and open it, modify the settings, save, bada bing, bada boom, you're done. All right, let's go ahead and switch to our presentation and tackle all these things. We're logged on to our domain controller, and what I've done is I've downloaded the profile management package from Citrix.com. So profile management is again a separate download that you would have to do from Citrix.com. You can go to My Citrix and just the download section and download it. Now I'm choosing to do the profile management ADM on my domain controller. That's just a matter of preference. You can do it from another server that might have the group policy management console perhaps. I'm just showing you different ways by which you can do things. So I've copied the package over here. Now if you open up the package, there's a folder under it called ADM templates. If you go in there, choose the language that you want, and this is the particular file that we're interested in importing into Active Directory. So I've exported that onto my desktop. We're going to launch Active Directory users and computers, and you'll notice that I have an OU called Citrix. Under that OU there's a container called servers, and under that I have my XA01 and XA02 servers. Now what I want to do is I want to create a group policy dedicated for profile management. So again, we're going to right click here and we are going to go to Properties, Group Policy, and we're going to create a new group policy called Profile Management. Once we're done, we're going to click on Edit. Let's go ahead and expand that, change the view here a little bit. So this is a policy that deals with profile management. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load it under Administrative Templates. So I'm going to right click on Administrative Templates, click Add Remove Templates, and I'm going to clear up this list just so we're not, keep things nice and neat here. Click on Add, and click on the desktop, and I'm going to find that particular ADM file. Now once you've uploaded the file, you can feel free to delete it off of the desktop. So it uploads it into the database. It doesn't have to remain on the desktop or anywhere else. You can move it around. Once it's uploaded, you're going to click on Close, and now if you expand Administrative Templates here, you have access to Citrix and the profile management configurations and settings that you can now start managing. So let's go ahead and get started by configuring it. Let's go ahead and expand this completely. And if we select profile management, the first thing we want to do is we want to actually enable profile management. So we're going to go ahead and double click on the policy here and say enabled, which would enable profile management immediately. Now, processed groups. You have the ability of allowing profile management to be implemented for certain groups, and for certain other user groups, you probably don't want to have it implemented. So if you want to force profile management for certain groups, you can go ahead and configure this particular policy by enabling it and selecting the appropriate groups that you want. For our purposes, we're going to keep it not configured. So what happens when it's not configured is it's going to check with the INI file that's local to that virtual machine that has the profile management service. And if it's not configured there as well, then it's just going to process it for everyone. Now, if you wanted to process it for everyone immediately, what you could do is you could double click on it and set it to disabled. And you'll notice that if it's set to disabled, it's going to process for everybody automatically. Anytime you have any doubts about what a particular entry within group policy does, you can always read on it on the left here. Or if you double click on it, there's an explain tab that goes through the different settings and what they do. Now, process for local administrators. This is interesting. It depends on your environment. Because I'm in a lab environment, I'm using the local administrator to do a lot of these demonstrations. I want to make sure that my profile management gets processed for the local administrators as well. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and enable this policy. In your environment, it might be different. Now, the other thing that we have to do is specify a path to where we want to store our profiles. So what I'm going to do is double click on Path to User Store. And we're going to select Enable. And I'm going to specify a UNC path that I've pre-provisioned to store my profiles. And I'm going to do 10.4.1.16/profiles. And if we go ahead and copy this, let me show you that currently that particular directory is empty. Well, there's nothing in there at the moment. Now, what we're going to do is also do a backslash, and then we're going to put a %username%. This is an environmental variable that basically says under the profiles directory, I want you to create a directory based on the username of the user that's logging on to these virtual machines. So it's going to take that username and create a directory under profiles. We're going to click on OK. Now, active writeback is really cool. So typically, the way profiles work is as soon as you log in or as soon as you log out, the profile is going to synchronize, whether it's roaming or whatever the case might be. With active writeback, that profile is going to be synchronizing during the session. It doesn't wait until the login or the log-off process for it to synchronize. It synchronizes during the session. So when it comes time to log off, that log-off process is very quick because it doesn't have anything to do. It already synchronized most of the files. So I strongly recommend that you enable this particular setting. And then let's go down the list. Let's start with profile handling. Again, these are some maintenance tasks. Do you want to delete locally cached profiles on log off? Probably a good idea. So we're going to enable that. That way it's always clean. Migration of existing profiles. This allows you to migrate existing profiles and make them Citrix profiles if you choose to do so. So if you enable this policy here, you have several options on which types of profiles you're trying to migrate. Are you migrating just local and roaming? You don't want to migrate anything, roaming alone. For my purposes, I'm going to keep this as not configured. Now, if there's a local conflict between profiles, if there's an existing profile and it doesn't know which one to use, here you're telling it what to do in the event of a conflict. In the event of a conflict, it can use local profile, or you can tell it to use delete the local profile or rename the local profile. So when it finds a conflict, these are some of the action items that it can take against that conflict. We're going to keep this as not configured for our purposes. And template profile. Template profile is really cool. So typically in Citrix environment, terminal services, whatever the case might be, we modify the default user quite extensively and make the default user sort of like the gold default profile. So with profile management, now they've made it easy. If you've created a default profile that you want to make the master profile, so to speak, you can come in here, enable it, and then specify the path to that gold profile or master profile so that any profile is modeled after this particular profile. So you can choose to do that again if you like. So let's keep moving down to advanced settings. The first setting here, number of retries when accessing locked files, basically allows you to specify what it needs to do when it comes across a locked file, how many times that it should it retry. Second option specifies the location of the MFT cache file or directory. Process internet cookies on logoff. Sometimes there are cookies that reside outside of the index.dat. Index.dat doesn't know about them. So what you do by enabling this policy is you force index.dat to acknowledge these cookies and process them, and also deletes them, thereby not allowing the profile to grow and have a lot of profile bloat. Delete redirected folders. This is typically when you have folder redirection enabled. It doesn't clean after itself when you have the option move files to the new folder redirection. It would leave instances of that file behind, so you end up with two local copies of that folder structure. So by enabling this policy, you're also deleting those folders. Now if we go to the log settings here, there's a bunch of policies for log files and how to configure them. You can feel free to play around with how you want to enable logging. Registry allows you to have inclusions and exclusions lists from a registry perspective. So for example, if we click on the exclusions list here and we click on enable, you can specify registry entries that you want to exclude or registry entries that you want to include. So if you want to get very, very granular and specific with what you're doing from a profile management perspective. So I'm going to cancel out of here. Let's go into file system. There's a couple of interesting things in file system. Let's take a look at what there is in the root of that folder first. So the exclusion list, so typically by default, folder management is going to synchronize all the files in the profile. Now, if there are certain files or certain directories that you want to exclude out of the synchronization process, you don't want it to synchronize, for example, cookies. You don't want it to synchronize certain aspects of the profile. You can exclude that in a list here for files or for directories. Now let's take a look inside synchronization a little more. You can specify which directories you want to synchronize. You can specify which files you want to synchronize. And you can specify which folders you want to mirror. Now folder mirroring is kind of interesting. It comes into effect when you have something like the cookies directory that has all of the cookies and then it has an index.dat. It's interesting because you're mirroring exactly the same structure and underlying architecture of that folder so that the index file knows exactly where those files are located and they haven't moved sort of on the underlying structure of that folder. So folder mirroring is kind of interesting. Streaming user profile is probably the most interesting new feature with profile management. What it allows you to do, and I strongly recommend that this should be enabled, is it streams the profile in the background. So typically when you're using folders or profiles for that matter, what happens is on log on or log off, all the files are going to be downloaded or uploaded, and then it does, certain profile management will do tricks to speed up the process, so on and so forth. Folder streaming is more interesting. What it does is it will download your profile in the form of stubs. So for example, think about it this way. If you have 10 or 15 different Word files on your desktop, instead of copying those Word files down to the profile when you're logging in, it will download a stub or a shortcut to that file. Now, as far as you're concerned, as far as your profile is concerned, that file is there. However, that file hasn't been downloaded. If you decide that you want to access this file and you double click on it, so it's going to launch Word, at that point Profile Manager will download that file from the profile and open it up locally for you. What this does is it speeds up the log on and log off process, because in most cases when you're using your profile files, you're not accessing all the files all the time. So why download them back and forth and upload them and save them if you're not really using them? Download them when you need to use them. So it's a very, very handy feature to enable profile streaming. Now this controls how you want to do the caching of the files. So what you're doing with always cache is you're specifying, so if you enable this, you're specifying the size of the files that you want to cache. So any files that are larger than X megabytes, I want you to cache it. Thereby, it doesn't download it until the user requests access to that particular file. Very, very handy. This enhances the profile streaming process. So we're going to keep this as not configured for us. Timeout for pending area lock files is really interesting, and this is in days. Think about this policy in this way. Sometimes when you're working on a server, terminal server, Zen desktop, whatever the case might be, and your server crashes, the server goes down for whatever reason, typically your profile hasn't completely written up to the directory where it's stored on the network. So it's sort of in like a hanging state in a pending area. So by specifying this policy, you're specifying how many days it needs to wait before it flushes out the pending area, writes and completes that profile so that there's no profile corruption and that profile is usable again. Very handy policy again. Streamed user profile groups, again, you're specifying here which user groups are going to participate in the profile streaming function. And that's it for group policy. Once you've configured everything the way you want, the only thing left is to get out of group policy here. Let's go ahead and exit out. We're going to click on close, and let's get out of the Active Directory users and computers as well. At this point, the only thing that's left to do is to install the service that will allow the group policy specifics to the profile management to be enforced on the endpoint, wherever you're going to install it. Now, that particular service, there's really nothing much to configure. It's a very straightforward installation, but I'm going to go through it with you guys just for completion's sake. So to do that, let's go ahead and switch to our Zen app server, XA01, and install the service where it should be installed. So on the Zen app server, what I've done is I've copied the profile management package. So I'm going to double click on it, and we're just going to run the x64 version of this particular package. Now again, there's really nothing to see here. There's nothing fancy or anything special about this installation. It's a very straightforward installation with a couple of prompts. We're just going to click on next, accept the license agreement. This is the default path where it's going to be installed in, and install. And that's it. We'll click on finish. You must restart your computer. For now, we're not going to restart this machine. We're going to exit out of WinRAR. So what you've just done is you've installed the framework. You've installed the engine that is required to process the commands that you're issuing from the group policy objects. Because these group policy objects aren't native to Windows, we had to tell the endpoint what these mean and how to execute them. That's where this engine comes into play. And if you're configuring it with group policy, great. But there's one more thing that I wanted to show you here is if you didn't want to configure it with group policy, you can do so by configuring it through an INI file. And to do that, once you've installed the agent on the endpoint, you can always go to the C drive, Program Files, Citrix, User Profile Manager, and voila. This is the file that you are looking for. Again, it's very self-explanatory. It's the same settings that we went through in group policy, except you're setting them through pretty much a text editor, and you're making them for this particular machine at this point. And so if you wanted to do it via INI, you would have to replicate the same settings to all of your servers. Now, obviously, one easy way of doing this is that you would modify it once and copy that INI file to the rest of them. But it's a little annoying because every time you make a change, you have to do that same copy process, etc., etc. However, I do recommend that in the event that maybe Active Directory isn't stable, maybe something is going on, to have this as a backup plan. So it doesn't hurt to have the INI, because if the group policy isn't processing, the INI will process, and as a result, there's no interruption or there is no user experience degradation from a user perspective, because they're still getting everything that they need to get. This is local to the particular machine. Let's get out of here, and that's all there is to profile management, really. So let's go ahead and switch back to our presentation and recap what we learned. Cool, sweet, and straight to the point. That's a pretty cool lesson, don't you think? Alright, so let's recap what we learned here. We started off by talking about, well, why profile management, the importance of profile management in a Zen app environment, and why you would want to use it. Now, the more servers you have, you want to be able to give your users a consistent user experience when they're logging on from server to server. And the frankly, the tools that you get with Microsoft, and so from a roaming profile perspective, or even if you're customizing group policy objects and folder redirection, it's not very flexible and it doesn't do the job right. So using a profile management solution allows you to deliver that consistent user experience to your users across multiple servers in the environment. Now, we also talked about the different user profile types. We talked about mandatory profiles, how the fact that they're locked down and every time the user logs in, they would download that same profile locally. We talked about roaming profiles, some of the pros and cons of roaming profiles, especially the fact that it only gets initiated, or it only kicks in when the user logs off. It initiates a copy of all the settings that were made during that session onto the network, and when the user goes to log on, it downloads the entire profile again. We talked about some of the cons in the matter of if the user is logged on to two XenApp servers at the same time and he or she logs off, then it's going to start copying to the network at the same time, and it might overstep on some files, which could lead to profile corruption, in addition to long log on and log off times, which again give the user a bad taste in their mouth for the particular solution that you're delivering. We talked about local profiles and the fact that they're a great solution, except if you have 50 servers and users are logging on to a different server every time they hit an application, they have to configure the profile every time. And if you run a maintenance once a month and clean up all the local profiles off the servers, then the user have to go through that exercise once again. We talked about the fact that Citrix Profile Manager is a better approach to profile management than the traditional Microsoft tools that you have, and the fact that with Citrix Profile Manager, as is the case with third-party profile managers, during the session when you're saving files, those files automatically get saved to the network right away. It doesn't wait until log on or log off before it makes any kind of change, which renders the log on and log off process very, very smooth and very, very quick. We then talked about the different profile manager components. We talked about the fact that there's an agent that gets installed on the endpoint. In this case, it would be the XenApp servers. This particular agent can be installed on XenApp servers, on Xen desktop virtual machines, and VDI agents if you wanted. It could be installed on just traditional physical machines, not even through a Citrix solution. You have the GPO component, which allows you to manage and configure the profile settings from a centralized location in Active Directory group policy objects, or you can modify or manage the settings through an INI file that gets installed with the agent that you install on the endpoints. With that, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.